This episode of the e-commerce playbook is brought to you by the Make Ads That Convert training series from creative analytics platform Motion. This free virtual series will take you deep into the mechanics of making Facebook and TikTok ads that convert like crazy. Get unrivaled access to world-class experts for an intensive 5-part training series every Thursday from May 23rd to June 20th. Check out the link in the show notes to get your free ticket today. Hey folks, welcome to the e-commerce playbook podcast. I'm your host, Richard Gaffin, Director of Digital Product Strategy here at CTC. And I'm joined today by Taylor, our CEO here at Common Thread. Taylor, what's going on today, man?
Not much, man. Just another week back at it. Little League playoffs this week. So trying to stay focused on the work. Got a coach's thread going, brainstorming it up, but having fun.
Nice, man. Cool. Well, I think one of the reasons we wanted to jump on the mic, I guess we do it every week, but particularly this week. So for those of you who obviously listen to the podcast, last week we dropped an episode about SaaS pricing. And essentially, my understanding anyway, is that the essential debate is SaaS pricing going to zero? Essentially was like, let's say one side of the debate. And on the other was Taylor saying, well, of course, this is not going to happen. And
to be clear, it started more as, is Yotpo evil? That was probably the general topic. And what does it mean to be evil with your pricing? And I got in the middle of it.
No, a wide-ranging conversation about is capitalism evil or not. It really got big. But I think particularly, like, Taylor, what you wanted to talk about today was maybe reinforcing a little bit of your side of the coin, or rather talking a little bit more about the role of brand within the SaaS field. So maybe just for those of us who missed last week's pod, sort of recap the context and the background of this particular discussion.
Yeah, and I think this was worth following up on because it got as much engagement, I think, as any content we put out recently. It was obviously clearly an industry topic that people were interested in. And part of that was because I think it was a really candid, authentic conversation between people who had been confrontational passively, maybe on Twitter in the past. And so I think people appreciated that. But the idea was just that there are a series of products, particularly in the SaaS world, that have over time, and Tomer, I think, addressed this really well, which was like, as they've run into TAM issues, in other words, they've got about as much of the market as they can get. The way they've tried to grow is by growing the billable or increasing price, which makes sense. You have to continue to find revenue growth somewhere, and if there aren't new customers to be had, then you have to try and extract more from the customers you do have. And so price is one lever to do that. And so I think some people have found that to be an exploitive practice. And I think in some cases, sales teams have gotten a little predatory and over aggressive and really working hard to try and coerce people. Maybe they feel like sometimes into contracts that don't benefit them. And so I think at the heart of that was just a question about how software should be priced. And it kind of brought it into a conversation about, is software for e-commerce a good business model? Are these things all going to be commoditized? Is this sort of the inherent flaw of software, is that it just is open source in some way and anybody can replicate it really quick? And so why would you ever choose any option but the cheapest one? And it was a wide-ranging conversation that I think was interesting. And for me, like my position in it, we don't run a software business very intentionally because I do think there's some flaws in the business model. But what it allowed us my position is to try and insert a little bit of my perception of how people buy these tools. And I think this relates to our business as well on the service side, which is what goes into a purchase decision. And I think Sean's opinion was very utilitarian, just in the sense that like it's this very logical decision between price and value. And my experience of it is it's much more than that. There's a lot more that goes into that decision. And I think I also have been out at events recently and sort of contemplating, why do I go to events? What's the point there? And I think it relates to a similar idea, which is that the perception of the thing matters and human relationship affects perception. And this industry is fairly small and you can actually influence it pretty dramatically by getting the right people saying the right things about you.
Okay. So maybe let's unpack that element of I'm trying to think maybe how to frame this, but maybe it's just like, this is part of a larger discussion about brand as sort of a inherent value of a product that you buy. So let's talk about that.
That's right. And I think that's a good place to go with this, because if we think about trying to bring value here to listeners who may be running consumer brands or agencies or software businesses for that matter, here's what I would encourage you to consider is that what people say about you in the intimate communities that you're a part of actually affects the value of your product. That's what I mean, is that we think of value often very strictly in financial terms, but there is absolutely value for people experientially in the relationships that they participate in business, is that you will pay more to be alongside people that you like, that reinforce positive things about your own identity. These are all realities that actually affect purchase decisions. If someone is a shitty asshole, pardon my language, and but their product has great value, people will opt out of that. It often can't be overcome if the experience of it all, or if, like, I think another great example is like, we're watching something really interesting play out right now, where on Twitter this week, there was a debate between Moise Ali and Andrew Dudum, Andrew Dudum's the founder of Hims. And he made a statement on Twitter that was sort of addressing Israel's behavior as genocide in Palestine. And Moise responded, and clearly that the political disposition of an organization affected people's buying decisions. You had people on each side saying that they were going to unsubscribe or subscribe on the basis of these opinions. Yeah. And that to me is just this illustration that your product is more than its ability to create economic impact for its users. It's bigger than that. And we could think about this on a consumer product, software, or services level, that it really matters how people feel about using your thing.
So let's talk about then maybe, because what strikes me is like there's a difference here between, like the famous experiment or whatever is like you put $2 Chuck into two different bottles, and one of the bottles of wine, says Clos do whatever. It's like really nice. And then the other bottle is just like, obviously $2 Chuck. People will try both. They'll swear that the one in the nice bottle tastes better, right? So there's that one element of brand perception, maybe taken to an extreme. But then with a product or with a SaaS product, where it feels to me like there's more scrutiny on the ROI of this product as compared to, like, let's say D2C, like a consumer good. What do you think the inflection point is where people start, where the cost consideration is great enough to overcome any objection or rather any sort of attraction to the brand, let's say, because of those things?
Yeah, that's a great, there are products that in and of themselves are so fantastic that like the human component is diminished, and they can stand on the merits of their own feature set. Now, I think what we're dealing with in our world is that that's not true of email. That's not true of SMS. Like, you can't create a product that's that differentiated. And so in that case, brand, and in particular, I'd say the managed service component of the product. Who are the people that I interact with? How helpful are they? Are they kind? Are they available? Those things begin to round out the perception of the business in entirety, and you begin to ascribe value to things beyond the feature set of the product. And I see this all the time as it relates to how people interact with agencies a lot too. There's this sense by which you have a relationship in some cases with the people involved, and that has an effect of how you see the experience of the service. And the classic example is, like, I just think that, like, I'll use BG and I. Why do CTC and Igloo and now Skullcandy have such a productive relationship as a service provider and vendor? Well, I think it's rooted very much in mine and Brian's relationship with each other, where we care about each other, and if there's issues, we're candid with each other and we solve it. And so all the downstream work sort of is born out of that foundation, where we both trust the people we hire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So rooted in that is, like, is CTC's service functionally different between CTC and Skullcandy than it is between CTC and other vendors? Well, maybe at the fringes with different people and different stuff, but at the heart of it, no, it's not. So why is it so productive? Well, because it's rooted in something more than that. And I think that you could sort of replicate that idea. Why do people love SendLane all the time? Well, they see Jimmy working his ass off to go build relationship and caring about people and showing up and appreciating them, like, in a way that's different than, is the email UI of the interface better than, it's like, that's not how people are thinking about this.
Big announcement. The Make Ads That Convert training series, hosted by the creative analytics platform Motion, is starting on May 23rd. 4 performance marketing megastars, Morella Crespi, Jess Bachman, Savannah Sanchez, and Dara Denny, are coming together on the same stage for the first time to teach you how to power up your creative strategy. They've managed hundreds of millions of dollars in ad spend. They've turned unknown D2C brands into household names. And now they're joining forces to teach you creative operations and planning, ramping up ad production, mastering creative hooks, and more. With your free ticket, you'll get VIP entry to all 5 live sessions, live Q&As and secret bonuses, and recordings of all sessions. So check out the link in the show notes to get your free ticket today. Right. So in an environment where there's no, like, I guess like the ROI difference between one platform and another is sort of negligible, perhaps. It's like they all functionally do the same thing, that the only differentiation here, just kind of like in any other glutted market, is customer service, really, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I would say it's more true in those industries, but I think it's true in every industry, which is just to say that a product is more than its technical features. A business is more than its technical features. It is the sales organization. This is the thing I think about again for CTC, is that I am so proud that people's first touch point into our business is Peter and Matt, like as human beings, right? Like it's really critical. I think about our marketing collateral, this podcast, like I'm proud of the sequence of events that lead to the actual technical experience of the product. And so I think all of it matters. And there is that, and that's why you can build big businesses off a brand. That's why I actually believe that Yotpo and what Tomer is doing will reconstruct their image in a way that more often, more people will say more positive things about them. And the tidal wave of that is a just reduced friction in the sales process and the continuity of use that can offset a few $100s a month, or even maybe $1,000 a month. There is a real value assigned in that kind of interaction.
Mm-hmm. So part of the reason that maybe this came to mind in this discussion, does that have something to do with the fact that like, or my understanding anyway of like the basis of the discussion is it's like, is the way that like say some of these SaaS platforms are raising their prices or getting revenue or whatever unethical in some way? And as part of what we're saying here is that like charging more for the brand gap is totally a reasonable thing to do, or like how does that aspect of it play into the more ethical part?
Yeah, so I think there were sort of tiers. Initially, we sort of established that the idea of it being evil was sort of a joke, and that
sure.
what Sean does believe is evil is deceptive pricing, right? If I lead you to believe that I'm creating value, so he brought up rev shares from apps like TapCart was the one that was pointed out a lot, where we're going to take a percentage of revenue that we generate, but that revenue generation is really sort of just like an attribution, like accounting fugazi, like that feels really deceptive in a way that attempts to misrepresent the value creation. And I think that's fair. Now, I would push back that like, I don't know. I think there's probably a genuine argument on the other side that there is value being created, and you'd have to really suss that out in every case. I don't know it's truly an attempt to deceive, but in the event that somebody was attempting to deceive someone on the basis of price, that feels into a category of like unethical, right? So we sort of like drew that line. And then there was just like, is this too expensive? Are you charging too much and you're going to be undercut by a cheaper option? And should somebody just always take the cheapest commoditized? If the layer is truly commoditized, do you just accept the cheapest option? And this is where like I would be really cautious of that as an idea, because I think that sometimes the gap between the cheapest option and the next level up, assuming that next level up is because there's an investment in the care that's required to interact with the customers, that it may be worth it, even though the feature set and therefore the economic result of the business is the same. Now, I think about this a lot with how people interact with Meta or Google reps, where I'm willing to bet that there are a lot of people that would pay additional money, higher CPMs even potentially, in the event that they got a hands-on rep dedicated and available to them in the event that anything were to break ever. So there is just a reality that both customer service as well as just, do I like getting on the Zoom call with you, is worth some amount of money that's not directly quantifiable in the tech specs.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, I think, it's in the name, service, right? And I think that there's like a huge opportunity to create a gap there. Like the idea that there could ever be true parity on the service side, that just seems like ridiculous to me. Like the idea that like there's always an opportunity to do better in terms of what the customer experience is.
I mean, I think
the product like that.
I think a lot about like Chick-fil-A and In-N-Out, right? As fast food restaurants with like, you could argue till you're blue in the face about whether the food is actually different food, but they're tomatoes and lettuce and meat and bread. But in both cases, what you have is an intentional effort to move front forward a disposition of the people that interact with you to be positive, appreciative, grateful, and energetic. And like, that's worth money. It just is. And so I think that if I'm running a software business part of the playbook of how I get to getting more value for my business is I offer you experiential value, not just economic value. And you got to do both, no doubt about it. But there's a lot to be said for, and in the human survey, if you run a marketing agency, it's probably even more important, is that, do you know what sucks? Getting on a phone call every week for hours with people you don't like. Like, that sucks. Like, that is draining of your life force. Like, nobody wants to give away time to people that they just find to be antagonizing. Like, it's just not something you'll do. And so there's just a real value in that piece of it. And also so that's like experiential customer service. There's also like identity here, which is just to say that we all believe something about ourselves. And if you can make it really clear what you as a business represent, maybe that's a political ideology, like representing some side of a global conflict, or maybe it's like we are a profit first organization. So like CTC right now, I would say is finding itself in dispositional harmony with a very specific subset of customers. You don't come to CTC as a customer if you're like, you know what we want to do? Growth at all costs, ramp it up and lose money in the process. Like, we're not going to be the client vendor for you. But if you show up and you have a preference for profitability and you really want to understand contribution margin, all these things, like that ideological shared ground actually matters because that's part of your identity, and working with CTC reinforces that disposition. So you want to give people something that says something about themselves when they use it. It's why like Sent from iPhone or Sent from Superhuman are really powerful brand statements that get built into products, because me using Superhuman says something about me as the kind of person I want to present myself as in the way I work.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to dive back into this discussion of brand a little bit deeper, just particularly as it relates to, let's say, D2C brands, because that's most of our listenership. And I think it's interesting that we're having this discussion today, because just a few days ago, I watched just an interview with Scott Galloway, the NYU marketing prof, he's a haver of hot takes for sure. But this is probably from a few months ago, but one of his hot takes is that the era of brand is dead. The idea that you can create parity for a product, or not parity, but rather create differentiation for a product because of brand rather than because of product. Those days have been over for a while now. It's not the 60s anymore, whatever. But obviously, like, the claim that you're making is, in some ways, feels like the polar opposite of that. And that in some ways, maybe potentially there's a golden age of brand that maybe needs to happen as product parity becomes more common. So maybe speak to that a little bit. Like,
so here's how does this, like, there's some really obvious categories. Like, we work with Liquid Death, and like, I don't know that there's a better example in the world right now of a brand that just said, like, we will just be a brand. And like, the product will all be secondary to this idea of who we are as a brand. They sell water. Like, another category I think about a lot is, you've seen people do this, like, taste tests where it's like, underneath here is like 5, I did it with my kids, like 5 sports fruit drinks, right? And in that box, like, they're going to taste them all and they're going to try and guess which is which. And they can't do it, like, because the product's actually truly indistinguishable. And I think Prime is a great example of this right now, where you watched as like that brand almost like ebbs and flows relative to the perception of Logan Paul and the interaction of it in entirety. Like, the sports drink is not the product at all. So there are probably categories, and Scott Galloway probably lives a little bit more in the tech world where that certainly does matter, but I think a little bit more in terms of the functionality. And if you were, going to, I don't know, some very tech forward obligation you better make sure the product works. Like, I think about my car, like, the car actually has to do the things it says it does. But even that, like, it's just really like, I don't believe for a second that the ideas in my head about why, for some reason right now, I'm interested in the Rivian SUV has anything to do at all with the product features. Like, like, I don't know the first thing about cars, but there's something about the way it's been presented to me, who has it, what it's like, its coolness that makes me want it for some reason. And I think that's entirely great.
Yeah. Okay. So let's maybe dive into thinking about some, like, maybe practical applications of this, like, particularly for a D2C brand, because I think that the opportunities for this sort of customer service or experiential thing that you're talking about with, say, a SaaS product or with an agency like Common Fair Collective, there are fewer opportunities to do that in such a a literal way, maybe. So talk about like what does brand building look like in 2024 for a D2C brand and how it can sort of apply some of these?
So I actually think that there is a massively underrated component of brand building, especially in the early days, that is really, really human. And it has a lot to do with events and communities, right? So I'll use Kalo as an example, and then I'll talk about one of our customers. So Kalo, in the early days, we did a lot of events. And one of the events that we did early on was anything related to the firefighter games or the police, any police officer events. Like we would go to these, be very present, to the point that by like year 3, one of the founders, Ted, at one of these events, and I forget the circumstance of why this occurred, but they were doing weddings. And he was like the officiant of like 50 firefighter weddings at this thing where he had become a part of the community by being there. And what happens is a very small group of people who have wildly positive things to say about you inside of a tight-knit community where word of mouth travels with very little friction, can have a massive corresponding effect. I think about this right now with Born Primitive. It's a client of ours. And again, when there are communities that are sort of already networked with one another, physical presence can be really impactful. So there was this issue related to a flag that was hanging at a fire station, and Born Primitive committed to sending flags to a bunch of fire stations. And they did this digitally, so it wasn't necessary, but the object was physically present. And in reality, it's only going to affect a small number of people in like, if you measure things on like a reach basis or a total impression basis. But inside of this really loyal community of people, the value that gets associated and assigned to the business is a lot, right? And I think in the early days of a brand, finding those communities where we used to call them like digitally identifiable, where there are attributes that people put their hand up and say, I am this, and they aggregate in groups with other people who do that, right? So if you think about, go look at what Facebook groups exist and have large followings of them where people create an identity statement and then aggregate around it. If you are physically present amongst those groups of people that are networked well, and events is a really good way to do this. And this is why I think we've made an extra effort to be present at events this year in our industry, because I think our industry is like this. You can get disproportionate reward and value in goodwill assigned to your business in a way that won't be immediately obvious in like your Facebook ROAS on day 1, but it will till up a soil in a way that I think really matters into the future. But it's just, again, it's very human. It's like, we used to do this thing. I'll give you another example at Kalo that we did, is that when we identified a community like CrossFit, one of the things that we looked at were who were the most influential companies in the space. So which brands already had made traction and had authority in the space, and we would send product to all their executives. Because often the executives at those companies, they traverse those spaces with authority and credibility. And so if they are advocates of yours, you sort of get brought in alongside them. And so there's just this way in which you build a relationship map of, if my brand could have relationship with humans in the space of my category, which humans would I want to say good things about me? And how do I go build human relationship with them? And by doing that with 20 to 30 to 40 people, you can make a massive impact on the end outcome of your business.
Yeah. One thing that we used to talk about a lot when I was doing brand work was the idea that like what you're trying to replicate is the experience of like when you live in a small town and everybody knows, oh yeah, this is the lady who runs the jewelry store around here. This is the guy who runs the sporting goods franchise or whatever it happens to be. But you have a personal relationship with them. You see them around town. You have a human relationship with them, right? And what you're trying to do with brand is to replicate that personal knowledge. Like, how do you create a vibe around your brand such that it feels almost like a person that people are interacting with, that they trust, and that they can themselves have a relationship with? And, there's ways that whatever logo and colorways and brand or in that sense play into that as well. But obviously the easiest way to do that would be just to go be a human around other people in person at these types of events. But
I think if you just watch our industry play out. And I think what you'll see right now, especially in the SaaS world, is that the people that get the most praise relative to their behavior, right? It's Jimmy from SendLane, maybe Alex from Postscript. I think Aaron's trying to do this, right? And joining the team at Fermat. Like you're trying to take people who the industry views positively, and you're just trying to go out and build goodwill by caring about them. And like none of that has anything to do with the technical aspects of the product. Like, of course, at the end of the day, that has to matter too. So this is not an either or, but I do think in the conversation that we had last week, so much of the narrow focus was just on like price product. And if that were the case, like our consumption, if that was the thing that mattered to us more than anything else as consumers, our purchasing behavior would be very, very different in the way that we actually buy things.
Right on. Cool. All right. Is anything else you want to hit on this?
No, I think it is a part of this that when you think about the price of your product and the gross margin, okay, this is the last thing I'll leave you with, is that if you don't have great margin right now, a lot of times we think about solving that problem primarily through trying to reduce your cost of goods. Go back and negotiate more with your manufacturer, do something else. But maybe there's a way to increase the value of your brand and therefore create more margin in the product by building more goodwill and doing it through service. Like maybe that could be another thing to consider, is that maybe my thing could become more valuable if the experience of interacting with me became even more delightful. And so that's another way to think about creating value that really, like brand, I think a lot of times is just the gap between what something costs and what you can charge from it. Like that. And so I think that if you don't create some level of brand, that will get driven down to the root hard cost. And the only way to maintain that, I think, is what we're talking about. And it has a lot to do with that idea of brand.
That's right. All right, folks, go out and be a human. That's the moral of the story here. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all next week. Take care.